Keanu Reeves stood at the edge of what was supposed to be the greatest night of his life, an event so incredible, so jaw-dropping, that whispers of it would ripple through the world for years to come. Hollywood's most enigmatic star, a man known for his quiet humility and breathtaking action hero grit, had poured his heart into something personal, something sacred. But what unfolded that night wasn't just amazing, it was hilariously chaotic, explosively controversial, and borderline apocalyptic. Something happened at that backyard barbecue for veterans, something so wild that even Keanu, with all his cool-headed charm, couldn't have seen it coming. The world would soon be buzzing with questions. What pushed him to the edge? What shattered the peace? And why was one unhinged zealot at the center of it all? The evening began with the kind of golden warmth that only a late summer sunset could offer. Keanu had opened up his sprawling Los Angeles estate, a place he rarely let anyone see, to host a private barbecue honoring veterans. This wasn't some glitzy PR stunt or a celebrity photo op. No, this was Keanu at his core, a man who revered those who'd served, who wanted to give back in a way that felt real. The guest list was small, carefully curated, 50 veterans from all walks of life, men and women who'd seen the best and worst of humanity, plus 2 others Keanu trusted implicitly. His longtime friend Marcus, a grizzled ex-Marine turned chef, and Leela, a sharp-witted event coordinator who'd helped pull the night together. The air smelled of sizzling ribs, smoky brisket, and freedom, a perfect tribute to those who'd earned it. Keanu moved through the crowd with that effortless grace everyone knew him for, his black t-shirt clinging to his broad shoulders as he carried trays of food, poured drinks, and listened to stories of valor with a quiet intensity. This isn't just a story, it's a revelation. And if you want to see how far it goes, subscribe now before it disappears. Laughter echoed across the yard, mingling with the crackle of the fire pit and the strum of an acoustic guitar someone had brought along. The veterans swapped tales of battle and brotherhood, their voices rising and falling like a tide. For once, Keanu wasn't the star, he was the host, the glue, the man who made everyone feel seen. Marcus manned the grill, flipping burgers with the precision of a soldier assembling a rifle, while Leela darted around, ensuring every detail was flawless. It was a night of unity, a rare slice of peace in a fractured world. But peace, as Keanu would soon discover, was a fragile thing. The first sign of trouble came subtly, like a distant storm cloud on the horizon. A woman appeared at the edge of the property, uninvited, unnoticed at first. She was tall, wiry, with a wild glint in her eyes that didn't match the casual sundress she wore. Her name was Vanessa, though no one knew that yet. She carried a tote bag slung over her shoulder, its contents hidden, and her presence felt like a splinter in the otherwise smooth flow of the evening. Keanu didn't see her at first. He was too busy laughing with a Vietnam vet named Charlie, who was recounting a ridiculous story about a misadventure with a jeep and a stubborn mule. But Leela noticed. Her sharp eyes caught Vanessa lingering near the gate, her posture too stiff, too deliberate. Leela approached her cautiously, assuming she was a lost guest or maybe a neighbor drawn by the mouth-watering aroma of Marcus's cooking. Vanessa's response was curt, her voice clipped as she claimed she'd heard about the event and wanted to pay her respects. Something about her tone prickled Leela's instincts, but she let it slide. After all, this was Keanu's night, and he'd always been the type to welcome strays. So Vanessa stayed, hovering on the fringes, her gaze darting between the veterans and Keanu like a predator sizing up its prey. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, the mood shifted imperceptibly. The veterans were in high spirits, their camaraderie fueled by good food and better company. Keanu stood near the fire pit, a beer in hand, his dark hair catching the flickering light as he toasted the group. His voice was steady, warm, carrying that signature sincerity that made people lean in. He spoke of honor, of resilience, of the quiet strength these men and women carried every day. The crowd listened, rapt, their faces glowing with pride and gratitude. It was a moment of pure connection until Vanessa decided it was. She stepped forward, cutting through the circle like a blade through silk. Her tote bag swung heavily at her side, and her voice, shrill, unhinged, sliced through Keanu's words like a gunshot. She didn't introduce herself, didn't ease into it. She just erupted, her words tumbling out in a furious cascade that stunned everyone into silence. She railed against guns, against war, against the very people standing before her. Her accusations were wild, disjointed, calling the veterans murderers, blaming them for a world she claimed they'd broken. The air grew thick, tense as her tirade escalated, her arms flailing, her eyes blazing with a zealot's fire. Keanu froze, his beer halfway to his lips, his calm demeanor cracking just enough to reveal the storm brewing beneath. Marcus dropped his tongs, his massive frame tensing as if ready to charge. Leela stepped forward, her hands raised to de-escalate, but Vanessa wasn't stopping. She reached into her tote bag, and for a heart-stopping moment, everyone thought the worst, until she pulled out a stack of pamphlets, hurling them into the crowd like grenades. Anti-gun manifestos fluttered through the air, landing in the dirt on the tables in the fire pit where they curled and smoked. The veterans stared, some in disbelief, others with rising anger, but none moved. Not yet. Vanessa's meltdown was a spectacle, a one-woman war against everything Keanu had built that night. She screamed about blood on their hands, about toxic masculinity, about a society she claimed revered violence over peace. Her words were venom, spat with a ferocity that bordered on madness. And Keanu, the man who'd faced down assassins on screen and heartbreak off it, watched her with a stillness that belied the fury igniting inside him. This wasn't just an interruption. This was an attack on the people he admired most, on the night he'd crafted with such care. The veterans began to stir, their patience fraying. Charlie, the Vietnam vet, muttered something sharp under his breath, his weathered hands clenching into fists. A younger woman, a former sniper named Tara, crossed her arms, her gaze narrowing as if sighting a target. Marcus took a step forward, his shadow looming large, but Keanu raised a hand, a silent command to hold back. His eyes locked onto Vanessa, and in that moment, something shifted. The man who'd spent years dodging bullets in fiction was about to face a very real confrontation, one that would test his restraint, his resolve, and his reputation. Vanessa's tirade reached a fever pitch, her voice hoarse but unrelenting. She pointed at Keanu now, accusing him of glorifying war, of profiting off pain. The absurdity of it stung. The man who'd given millions to charity, who'd honored veterans with this very event, now painted as a villain in her twisted narrative. The crowd bristled, the tension coiling tighter with every word she spat. And then she made her fatal mistake. She lunged toward the fire pit, kicking at the flames as if to extinguish the spirit of the night itself, sending sparks and ash spiraling into the air. That was it, the breaking point. Keanu's calm shattered, not into chaos, but into something far more dangerous: purpose. He stepped forward, his movements deliberate, his presence commanding. The air seemed to still, the world narrowing to this single moment. Vanessa didn't see it coming, not the explosion of words or fists, but something far more devastating. Keanu Reeves, the quiet hero, was about to unleash a takedown so explosive, so unexpected, that it would leave everyone reeling. The night wasn't over, it was just beginning. The night had been poised on a knife's edge, teetering between celebration and chaos, when Vanessa's reckless kick at the fire pit sent embers spiraling into the darkening sky. Keanu Reeves stood there, his silhouette framed against the flickering flames, a man who'd spent a lifetime mastering calm under pressure. Until now. The air crackled with more than just the heat of the fire. It hummed with the raw, unfiltered energy of 50 veterans whose honor had just been trampled, and one man who'd had enough. Vanessa, oblivious to the storm she'd unleashed, shrieked on, her voice a grating symphony of rage and delusion. But Keanu's next move would silence her and stun the world. He didn't shout. He didn't charge. That wasn't his way. Instead, he stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel, each stride radiating a quiet fury that made the hairs on everyone's neck stand on end. The crowd parted instinctively, veterans stepping back not out of fear but out of reverence. They knew something monumental was about to happen. Vanessa whirled toward him, her wild eyes blazing, her pamphlets now scattered like fallen soldiers across the yard. She jabbed a finger at him, her voice rising to a banshee's wail, accusing him of hypocrisy, of betrayal, of everything she could hurl at a man who dared to honor warriors she despised. Keanu stopped just feet from her, close enough to feel the heat of her manic energy, close enough to see the sweat beading on her forehead. His face was a mask of steel, but his eyes, those deep, soulful eyes that had captivated millions, burned with an intensity that could have melted stone. The world seemed to hold its breath, the crackling fire and Vanessa's ragged, panting the only sounds piercing the stillness. And then, in a voice so low it rumbled like distant thunder, Keanu spoke, not to her, but to the night itself, to the veterans, to the very essence of what he stood for. He began with a story, not a Hollywood script, not a rehearsed speech, but a raw, unfiltered memory that poured from him like blood from a wound. He spoke of his father's friend, a Vietnam vet who'd lost everything, his legs, his family, his hope, yet found purpose in teaching a young Keanu how to fix a motorcycle. The man had died alone, forgotten by most, but not by Keanu, who'd carried that lesson of resilience through every trial of his own life. His words wove a tapestry of sacrifice, of quiet heroism, of the kind of strength Vanessa could never comprehend. The veterans listened, their faces softening, their fists unclenching, drawn into the gravity of his tale. Vanessa faltered, her tirade stumbling as Keanu's voice grew stronger, richer, pulling everyone into his orbit. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. Each sentence was a hammer strike, dismantling her accusations with surgical precision. He spoke of the veterans he'd met over the years, men and women who'd run into danger not for glory, but for each other. He painted pictures of muddy trenches, of sleepless nights, of lives saved and lost, stories he'd heard firsthand, stories that had shaped him. The crowd was spellbound, the air thick with emotion, as Keanu turned the night into a battlefield of words, reclaiming the honor Vanessa had tried to torch. But he wasn't done. Oh no, Keanu Reeves was just warming up. He pivoted, his gaze locking onto Vanessa with the precision of a sniper's scope. He didn't attack her personally. He didn't need to stoop that low. Instead, he dissected her ideology, her blind zealotry, with a clarity that cut deeper than any insult. He questioned her logic, her facts, her very understanding of the world she claimed to want to save. He asked how she could stand there on his land, surrounded by people who'd bled for her freedom to scream, and call them the enemy. His voice never rose above that steady, commanding tone, but every word landed like a grenade, exposing the absurdity of her meltdown. Vanessa shrank under the weight of his scrutiny, her bravado crumbling as the crowd's murmurs grew, some veterans nodding, others glaring at her with renewed fire. Marcus, still by the grill, crossed his arms, a smirk tugging at his lips as he watched Keanu dismantle her piece by piece. Leela stood frozen, her clipboard forgotten, her eyes wide with awe at the sheer force of Keanu's presence. The pamphlets smoldered in the fire pit, their edges curling into ash, a fitting metaphor for Vanessa's unraveling crusade. She tried to interrupt, her voice cracking with desperation, but Keanu raised a hand, not aggressively, but with such authority that she stopped mid-sentence, her mouth gaping like a fish out of water. And then came the masterstroke. Keanu stepped even closer, his shadow falling over her, and delivered a line so simple, so devastating, that it would echo in the minds of everyone present for years. He leaned in, his voice a velvet blade, and said, "You don't get to rewrite their scars with your ink." It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it hit like a tidal wave, a quiet condemnation that stripped Vanessa bare. The veterans erupted, not in cheers, but in a low, rumbling assent, a sound that vibrated through the ground itself, a chorus of agreement that drowned out her last, feeble protest. Vanessa staggered back, her tote bag slipping from her shoulder, her face a mask of shock and fury. She'd come to hijack the night, to turn Keanu's tribute into her soapbox, but she'd miscalculated badly. Keanu didn't need fists or guns to fight. He wielded truth like a weapon, and he just fired a shot that left her ideology in ruins. The crowd tightened around her, not threateningly but protectively, a wall of weathered faces and unyielding resolve. Charlie, the Vietnam vet, spat into the dirt near her feet, his disgust palpable. Tara, the sniper, tilted her head, her eyes glinting with a predator's calm, as if daring Vanessa to try again. Keanu turned away from her then, his back a silent dismissal, and walked toward the fire pit. He picked up a poker and stirred the flames, sending a fresh burst of sparks into the sky, a symbolic reclaiming of the night. The veterans rallied around him, their voices rising again, reclaiming the laughter, the stories, the bond she'd tried to break. Vanessa stood alone, a solitary figure dwarfed by the unity she'd underestimated, her meltdown reduced to a pathetic footnote in a night that belonged to Keanu and those he honored. But the story wasn't over, not by a long shot. Vanessa's humiliation was just the beginning. Something bigger was brewing, something that would push Keanu beyond words, beyond restraint, into a confrontation that would shake the very foundation of everything he'd built. The fire was still burning, and so was he. The fire pit roared back to life under Keanu Reeves' steady hand, its flames licking higher as if fueled by the raw energy pulsing through the night. The veterans had reclaimed their space, their voices weaving a tapestry of resilience that drowned out Vanessa's fading echo. She stood at the edge of the yard, a crumpled figure clutching her tote bag, her wild eyes darting between the crowd and the gate, like a cornered animal unsure whether to flee or fight. Keanu didn't spare her another glance. He'd said his piece, and the night belonged to the men and women who'd earned it. But the air still crackled with an unspoken promise, something unfinished, something volatile, waiting to ignite. Marcus flipped a fresh batch of ribs onto the grill, the sizzle cutting through the murmurs, his broad shoulders squared as if daring trouble to come closer. Leela hovered near the drink table, her sharp gaze flicking between Keanu and Vanessa, her instincts screaming that this wasn't over. The veterans, though buoyed by Keanu's words, carried a subtle tension in their postures, hands resting near pockets, eyes scanning the shadows. They'd seen chaos before, fought it, survived it, and they knew better than to let their guard down completely. The night had been hijacked once, they wouldn't let it happen again. Keanu knelt by the fire, feeding it another log, his movements deliberate, almost meditative. The glow cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the lines etched by years of loss and triumph. He was the eye of the storm, the calm that held everything together. But beneath that calm, a current of resolve surged, ready to break free. He'd faced down Vanessa's tirade with words, with honor, but something told him this wasn't the end of her crusade. Her silence now felt too heavy, too loaded, like the pause before a thunderclap. And he was right. Vanessa didn't leave. She didn't slink away into the night, defeated and shamed as she should have. Instead, she straightened, her wiry frame trembling with a renewed manic energy. She reached into her tote bag again, not for pamphlets this time, but for something heavier, something that glinted faintly in the firelight. A megaphone. The crowd didn't notice at first, too caught up in the resurgence of camaraderie, but Leela did. Her breath caught as Vanessa raised the device to her lips, her finger hovering over the power switch. Keanu's head tilted slightly, his peripheral vision catching the movement, his body tensing like a coiled spring. The megaphone blared to life with a piercing screech, shattering the night's fragile peace. Vanessa's voice boomed across the yard, amplified to a deafening roar, her words a torrent of venom that hit the crowd like a physical blow. She screamed about corruption, about Keanu's blood money, about a world that worshipped violence. She was relentless, her accusations growing wilder, more unhinged. She claimed Keanu was a puppet, a tool of war profiteers, twisting his tribute into a grotesque caricature of itself. The veterans flinched, some covering their ears, others turning toward her with fury blazing in their eyes. Keanu rose slowly, the poker still in his hand, his silhouette towering against the flames. The megaphone's wail was an assault, a violation of the sanctuary he'd created, and it struck a nerve deeper than Vanessa's earlier outburst. This wasn't just noise, it was a deliberate escalation, a calculated move to reclaim the narrative she'd lost. Marcus dropped his tongs again, his massive hands balling into fists, his marine instincts kicking in as he took a step toward her. Leela darted forward, her voice lost in the cacophony as she shouted for Vanessa to stop. But the zealot was beyond reason, her eyes locked on Keanu as if daring him to respond. The veterans reacted now, their patience snapping like a taut wire. Charlie, the Vietnam vet, hurled his beer can toward Vanessa, missing her by inches, the aluminum clattering against the fence. Tara, the sniper, moved with lethal grace, positioning herself between Vanessa and the crowd, her stance a silent threat. Others shouted, their voices rising in a chaotic swell, but Vanessa's megaphone overpowered them all, her rant spiraling into absurdity. Conspiracy theories about Keanu, about the military, about a world she alone could save. The yard became a battlefield of sound, the unity Keanu had fought for fracturing under the onslaught. Keanu's grip tightened on the poker, the metal cool against his palm, his calm facade giving way to something primal. He tried reason, he tried words, but Vanessa wasn't here to listen. She was here to destroy, to tear down everything he'd built with her noise and her hate. He stepped forward, the crowd parting again, their eyes on him, waiting. The megaphone screeched on, Vanessa's voice distorting into a shrill, inhuman howl, and Keanu knew he couldn't let it stand, not for himself, but for them, the veterans who deserved better than this. In one fluid motion, he hurled the poker, not at Vanessa, but at the ground near her feet. It struck the dirt with a resounding thud, kicking up a cloud of dust that silenced her for a split second as she flinched. The crowd gasped, the veterans cheering as the gesture landed like a declaration of war. Keanu didn't stop there. He strode toward her, his pace unrelenting, his presence a force of nature that dwarfed her amplified tantrum. Vanessa faltered, the megaphone dipping as he closed the distance, her bravado crumbling under the weight of his advance. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. He reached out and snatched the megaphone from her hands, his movements swift and precise, like a predator disarming its prey. The device squealed as he ripped it away, and with a single, decisive motion, he smashed it against the ground. The plastic cracked, the electronics sparking briefly before dying, and the silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum where her chaos had reigned. Vanessa stumbled back, her mouth open in shock, her weapon gone, her power stripped away in an instant. The crowd erupted, not in anger but in triumph. Veterans clapped, whistled, stomped their feet, their voices rising in a roar that shook the night. Marcus let out a booming laugh, slamming a fist against the grill in approval. Leela exhaled, her hands trembling as she watched Keanu stand over the wreckage of the megaphone, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. Vanessa's face twisted into a mask of rage and disbelief, but she was powerless now, a lone figure dwarfed by the unity she tried to shatter. Keanu turned back to the fire pit, his expression unreadable, the broken megaphone lying in the dirt like a fallen flag. He didn't say a word, he didn't have to. The act spoke louder than anything he could have said, a raw, visceral reclaiming of the night. The veterans rallied around him again, their spirits reignited, their bonds stronger than ever. But Vanessa wasn't done, not yet. Her eyes glinted with a dangerous spark, her hands clenching as she glared at Keanu's back. She lost the battle, but something darker was stirring, something that would push this night beyond chaos, into a reckoning no one could predict. The fire burned brighter, the smoke curling into the sky, and Keanu Reeves stood at its heart, unaware that the real storm was still to come. The fire pit blazed with renewed fury, its flames clawing at the night sky as Keanu Reeves stood at its center, the shattered remains of Vanessa's megaphone lying in the dirt like a vanquished foe. The veterans' cheers still echoed across the yard, a thunderous wave of defiance that drowned out the last echoes of her meltdown. Marcus grinned broadly, flipping a burger with a flourish, while Leela gathered the scattered pamphlets into a pile, her movements quick and purposeful, as if erasing Vanessa's presence from the earth itself. Keanu's silhouette against the fire was a monument to resilience, a man who'd turned chaos into triumph, but the night wasn't done testing him yet. Vanessa lingered at the edge of the gathering, her wiry frame trembling not with defeat, but with a simmering, unhinged rage. Her eyes wide and glassy, locked onto Keanu's back, her lips twitching as if muttering silent curses. The crowd had dismissed her, their attention returning to the food, the fire, the stories, but she wasn't invisible to everyone. Tara, the former sniper, kept her in her peripheral vision, her posture relaxed but her senses razor-sharp, like a hawk tracking a wounded rabbit. Charlie, nursing a fresh beer, muttered something about crazy broads to the vet beside him, his gravelly voice laced with disdain. The air hummed with a fragile peace, but beneath it, a current of danger pulsed, unseen by most. Keanu knelt by the fire again, feeding it another log, his hands steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. He felt the weight of the night, the veteran's gratitude, the unity he'd fought to preserve, but also a nagging unease, a whisper at the back of his mind that Vanessa's silence was too deliberate, too charged. He'd stripped her of her voice, her weapon, but he knew people like her didn't just slink away. They festered. They struck back. And as he straightened, brushing ash from his hands, he caught a flicker of movement in the shadows beyond the firelight, a glimpse of Vanessa slipping toward the house. She moved with purpose, her tote bag clutched tightly, her steps quick and erratic like a thief fleeing a crime scene. No one else noticed, not Marcus, busy at the grill, nor Leela, now chatting with a group of veterans near the drink table. The crowd was too immersed in their resurgence, too buoyed by Keanu's victory to see the threat slithering out of sight. But Keanu saw. His instincts, honed by years of navigating Hollywood's underbelly and the chaos of film sets, screamed that this wasn't over. You felt that, didn't you? That was no ordinary moment. If it hit you, hit like and let's keep going. He didn't hesitate. With a quiet nod to Tara, who met his gaze and understood instantly, he slipped away from the fire, his boots silent against the grass as he followed Vanessa's trail. The house loomed ahead, its warm light spilling through the windows, a stark contrast to the wild energy of the yard. Keanu's estate was a sanctuary, a place of minimalist beauty, wooden beams, open spaces, a motorcycle parked in the corner of the garage he'd left ajar. Vanessa had disappeared inside, her shadow darting past the glass doors leading to the kitchen. Keanu's pulse quickened, not with fear but with a cold, focused clarity. Whatever she was planning, it was personal now. She'd crossed a line from public tantrum to private vendetta, and he wasn't about to let her defile his home. He entered through the side door, his movements fluid, almost predatory, the house swallowing him into its quiet embrace. The kitchen was empty, the counters gleaming under soft lighting, a tray of untouched cornbread sitting near the sink, a remnant of the night's intended peace. But then he heard it, a rustling, a muffled clatter from deeper inside, near the living room. Keanu moved silently, his boots barely whispering against the hardwood, his senses attuned to every sound, every shift in the air. He rounded the corner and froze. Vanessa stood in the center of the room, her tote bag overturned on the floor, its contents spilling out like a confession of madness. Spray paint cans rolled across the rug, red, black, green, their nozzles hissing as she shook one furiously, her hands trembling with intent. She hadn't noticed Keanu yet, too consumed by her mission. The walls, pristine and bare save for a single framed photo of Keanu with a group of veterans from a past event, were her canvas. She raised the can, and with a violent burst of red paint, she scrawled a single word: murderer. The letters bled down the wall, jagged and accusing, a scarlet wound against the purity of the space. Keanu's breath caught, not from shock, but from a rage so deep it felt like ice in his veins. This wasn't just an attack on him. It was a desecration of everything he held sacred, a violation of the home he'd opened to those he admired most. Vanessa turned to grab another can, her movements frantic, and that's when she saw him. Her eyes widened, a mix of fear and defiance flashing across her face, but she didn't stop. She sprayed again, black paint this time, slashing a crude symbol, an anti-gun emblem across the photo, obliterating the faces of the veterans smiling beside him. He didn't shout, he didn't rush her. He stepped forward, his presence filling the room like a storm rolling in, his voice low and lethal. "Put it down." It wasn't a request, it was a command laced with a fury so controlled it was terrifying. Vanessa froze, the can slipping slightly in her grip, her breath hitching as she realized she misjudged him again. She thought him soft, a celebrity playing at nobility, but the man before her was something else, something forged in fire, unbreakable. She sneered, her voice a ragged hiss. "You can't silence me." She raised the can again, defiant, but Keanu was done with games. In 2 strides, he closed the distance, his hand clamping around her wrist with a grip that made her gasp. The can clattered to the floor, rolling away as paint pooled beneath it, a dark stain spreading across the rug. He didn't hurt her, he didn't need to. His strength was in his restraint, in the way he loomed over her, his eyes boring into hers with a force that stripped away her bravado. "You don't belong here," he said, each word a hammer strike, final and unyielding. He released her wrist, stepping back as she stumbled, her knees buckling under the weight of his gaze. She clutched her arm, her face twisting with humiliation, but her eyes still burned with that manic spark. She wasn't broken, not yet. She lunged for the bag, clawing at another can, but Keanu kicked it out of reach, the metal skidding across the floor with a hollow clang. He towered over her, his shadow swallowing her whole, and for a moment the room was a battlefield, 2 wills clashing, one unhinged, the other unshakable. Outside, the veteran's laughter drifted through the open window, a reminder of what was at stake. Tara appeared in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the firelight, her hand resting casually near her hip, a silent signal she was ready if Keanu needed her. But he didn't. He had this under control for now. Vanessa scrambled to her feet, her breath ragged, her hands empty but her mind clearly racing. She glared at him, her lips curling into a snarl, and then she bolted, not toward the door but deeper into the house, toward the garage. Keanu's jaw tightened. She was running, but not away, she was escalating, chasing some final, desperate act. He followed, his pace steady but relentless, Tara falling in behind him without a word. The night had spiraled beyond chaos now, into a realm of raw, uncharted stakes. Vanessa had pushed him too far, and whatever she was planning next would force Keanu to confront not just her, but the limits of his own resolve. The fire outside burned on, but inside, a different kind of inferno was about to erupt. The garage door loomed ahead, its metal surface glinting faintly under the dim overhead light as Keanu Reeves pursued Vanessa with a predator's focus. Her frantic footsteps echoed off the concrete, a staccato rhythm of desperation that clashed with the steady, relentless thud of Keanu's boots behind her. Tara shadowed him, her presence a silent promise of backup, her sniper's calm unshaken by the chaos unfolding. The air inside the garage was thick with the scent of oil and metal, a sanctuary of machines that Keanu had always cherished. Until now, when Vanessa's intrusion turned it into a battleground. The night had spiraled past reason, past restraint, and whatever she was planning in this final, reckless sprint would push Keanu to an edge he rarely crossed. Vanessa reached the far wall, her hands clawing at a workbench cluttered with tools, wrenches, screwdrivers, a gleaming motorcycle chain Keanu had been restoring. She whirled around, her wild eyes darting between him and the objects within reach, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. Paint stains streaked her sundress, red and black smears like war paint, a testament to her earlier rampage. She grabbed a wrench, hefting it with trembling hands, not as a weapon, at least not yet, but as a shield, a pitiful barrier against the storm bearing down on her. Keanu stopped a few feet away, his silhouette filling the doorway, the firelight from outside casting him in a halo of shadow and flame. "You're done," he said, his voice a low growl, each syllable heavy with finality. It wasn't a threat, it was a fact, delivered with the weight of a man who'd exhausted every ounce of patience. Vanessa's lips twisted into a snarl, her grip tightening on the wrench as she backed against the workbench, knocking over a can of bolts that clattered to the floor in a metallic cascade. She was cornered, trapped, but the madness in her eyes burned brighter than ever, a zealot unbowed, even in defeat. Tara lingered near the door, her hand still near her hip, her gaze flicking to Keanu for a signal, but he didn't need her, not yet. Vanessa's voice erupted, hoarse and defiant, a last gasp of her crusade. "You think this changes anything? You think you're some hero?" She swung the wrench wildly, not at him, but at the air, as if battling invisible demons. "You're nothing, just a cog in their machine, a pretty face for their wars." Her words were a jumbled mess, accusations bleeding into paranoia, but they carried a venom that stung deeper than her earlier rants. She was unraveling, her ideology fracturing under the pressure of her own failure, yet she clung to it like a drowning woman to a sinking ship. Keanu didn't flinch. He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming, his dark eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that could have stopped a freight train. "This isn't about me," he said, his tone cutting through her noise like a blade. "It's about them, the people you've insulted, the lives you've dismissed." He gestured faintly toward the yard, where the veterans' voices still rose in defiance of her chaos. "You don't get to judge what you've never understood." His words were a wall, unyielding and absolute, built from a lifetime of empathy and grit. Vanessa laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that grated against the silence of the garage. She dropped the wrench, letting it clang against the concrete, and reached behind her, fumbling along the workbench. Her hand closed around something, a glass bottle half filled with a dark liquid, its label peeling and faded. Keanu's eyes narrowed as she raised it, her intent flashing clear in the manic twist of her smile. Gasoline. The bottle trembled in her grip, a Molotov cocktail in the making, her desperation boiling over into something truly dangerous. "You want to honor them," she hissed. "Let's see how they feel when it all burns." Time slowed. Tara shifted, her hand moving instinctively toward her side, but Keanu was faster. He lunged forward, closing the gap in a heartbeat, his hand clamping around the bottle before Vanessa could ignite it. She shrieked, clawing at him with her free hand, her nails raking across his forearm, but he didn't relent. His strength overwhelmed her, his grip iron-tight as he wrenched the bottle free, sending it skidding across the floor to crash against the wall, the liquid spilling harmlessly into a dark puddle. Vanessa stumbled back, her momentum gone, her plan shattered in an instant. He didn't stop there. Keanu grabbed her by the shoulders, not roughly but with a force that brooked no resistance, and spun her around, pinning her against the workbench. Tools clattered to the ground, a symphony of chaos underscoring the moment. His face was inches from hers, his breath steady despite the fire in his veins, his voice a controlled roar. "You don't get to destroy this, not for them, not for me." It was the closest he'd come to losing it, the edge of his restraint fraying as the weight of her actions crashed over him. This wasn't just about a barbecue anymore. It was about the veterans, his home, his very soul. Vanessa struggled, her body wriggling against his hold, but she was no match for him. Her eyes blazed with a mix of hatred and fear, her breath hitching as she realized she'd pushed him too far. Tara stepped forward now, her voice calm but firm. "Keanu, I've got her." She pulled a zip tie from her pocket, a remnant of her military days, and moved to secure Vanessa's wrists. Keanu released her, stepping back as Tara took over, her movements swift and precise, binding Vanessa's hands as the zealot spat curses and threats that fell on deaf ears. The garage was a mess, tools scattered, paint splattered, gasoline pooling in the corner, but Keanu stood amidst it, his chest heaving, his composure slowly returning. He wiped a hand across his face, smearing a streak of paint from Vanessa's earlier attack, and exhaled, a long, slow breath that carried the weight of the night. Tara dragged Vanessa toward the door, the woman's struggles growing weaker, her voice fading into a pathetic whimper. "Call the cops," Keanu said, his tone flat, final. Tara nodded, already pulling out her phone as she hauled Vanessa outside, back toward the yard where the veterans waited, unaware of how close they'd come to disaster. Keanu stayed behind for a moment, alone in the garage, his gaze drifting to the motorcycle in the corner, his sanctuary now tainted by this madness. He clenched his fists, The sting of Vanessa's scratches a faint echo of the deeper wound she'd inflicted. The night had been about honor, about healing, and she'd nearly burned it all to ash. But it wasn't over, not yet. The veterans deserved more than this chaos, more than a victory marred by her insanity. Keanu straightened, his resolve hardening into something unbreakable. He fought for them in the yard, in the house, in this garage, and he wasn't done fighting. Outside, the fire still burned, the veterans' voices rising in the distance, a beacon calling him back. Vanessa was gone, her threat neutralized, but the night hung in a precarious balance, teetering on the edge of redemption or ruin. Keanu stepped toward the door, his shadow stretching long across the concrete, a man forged anew by the crucible of this ordeal. The real battle wasn't over, it was just beginning, and he'd see it through to the end. The garage door swung shut behind Keanu Reeves, its metallic clang a final punctuation to the chaos that had erupted within. Vanessa was gone, hauled away by Tara's steady hands, her manic threats reduced to a fading echo as the night reclaimed its rhythm. Keanu stood alone for a moment, the cool air of the garage brushing against his skin, the faint sting of scratches on his arm, a reminder of how close the evening had come to catastrophe. The spilled gasoline glistened in the corner, a dark testament to her madness, but the motorcycle, his pride, his sanctuary, stood untouched, a silent witness to his victory. He exhaled, long and slow, the tension bleeding from his shoulders as he turned back toward the yard where the fire still burned and the veterans waited. Outside, the scene had shifted subtly but profoundly. The veterans gathered near the fire pit, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames, a mix of curiosity and resolve etched into their expressions. Tara had Vanessa secured near the gate, her wrists bound, her head bowed as she muttered incoherently to herself. Leela stood nearby, phone pressed to her ear, her voice steady as she spoke to the police, relaying the night's descent into madness with clipped precision. Marcus tended the grill, his massive frame a pillar of calm amid the storm, though his eyes flicked toward Keanu as he emerged, a silent question lingering in their depths. The air buzzed with anticipation, the crowd sensing that the story wasn't over, not until Keanu made it so. He stepped into the firelight, his presence drawing every gaze like a magnet. Paint streaked his shirt, his hair was tousled from the struggle, but he carried himself with a quiet dignity that silenced the murmurs. The veterans watched him, their weathered faces reflecting a spectrum of emotions, gratitude, pride, a flicker of concern, but above all, trust. They'd seen him fight for them, not with fists or bravado, but with a resolve that ran deeper than words. Keanu stopped near the fire, his boots crunching against the gravel, and for a moment he simply stood there, letting the warmth wash over him, grounding him in the reality of what he'd preserved. Then he spoke, his voice rising above the crackle of the flames, steady and resonant, cutting through the night like a beacon. He didn't recount the chaos, didn't dwell on Vanessa's insanity. There was no need. Instead, he turned the focus back to them, the veterans, the heart of the evening. He spoke of their strength, their sacrifices, the invisible scars they carried with a grace most would never understand. His words were raw, unpolished, drawn from a well of experience and empathy that few could match. He told them of a promise he'd made to himself years ago, to honor those who'd given more than they'd ever asked for, to give them a night where they weren't just survivors, but heroes. The crowd listened, rapt, their earlier anger melting into something softer, something profound. Charlie, the Vietnam vet, wiped a tear from his eye, his gnarled hand trembling as he nodded along. Tara, standing guard over Vanessa, softened her stance, her sharp edges easing as Keanu's voice wove a spell of unity. Marcus set down his tongs, crossing his arms with a rare, genuine smile, while Leela hung up the phone, her clipboard forgotten as she leaned against the fence, caught in the gravity of the moment. The fire burned brighter, as if feeding off Keanu's words, its light pushing back the shadows Vanessa had cast. He didn't stop there. Keanu reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, worn notebook, a relic he'd carried for years, filled with names and dates, a private tribute to the veterans he'd met along his journey. He opened it, his fingers tracing the pages, and began to read aloud. Names of the fallen, of the forgotten, of those who'd shaped him into the man he was. Each name was a story, a life, a thread in the tapestry of resilience he'd woven that night. The veterans joined in, some calling out their own names, comrades lost, brothers and sisters remembered, until the air thrummed with a chorus of memory, a defiant hymn against the chaos that had tried to silence them. Vanessa's head snapped up, her eyes blazing with one last flicker of defiance, but it was futile. The police arrived then, their lights flashing silently against the fence, officers stepping out with a calm efficiency that matched the night's newfound peace. Tara handed her over, her zip ties holding firm as Vanessa was guided into the back of a squad car, her voice muffled by the closing door. She'd come to destroy, to hijack, but she left as nothing, a footnote in a story that belonged to Keanu and the veterans, a story she'd never comprehend. Keanu closed the notebook, slipping it back into his pocket, and turned to the fire. He picked up a stick, stirring the embers, sending a fresh burst of sparks into the sky, a final act of reclamation. The veterans gathered closer, their hands clasping shoulders, their laughter rising again, richer now, tempered by the ordeal they'd weathered together. Marcus brought out a tray of ribs, the smoky aroma pulling everyone back to the heart of the night, while Leela poured drinks, her smile wide and unguarded. The music started up again, the guitar strumming a slow, soulful tune that wrapped the yard in warmth. Keanu stepped back, letting the crowd take over, his role as host fulfilled. He leaned against the fence, a beer in hand, watching the scene unfold, veterans eating, talking, healing in the glow of the fire. Tara joined him, her quiet presence a comfort, her nod a silent acknowledgement of what they'd done. "You okay?" she asked, her voice low. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, they're okay, that's what matters." She clapped him on the shoulder, a rare gesture from a woman who lived in precision, and returned to the crowd. The night stretched on, the stars emerging above, sharp and clear against the velvet sky. The police lights faded into the distance, taking Vanessa's madness with them, leaving only the echoes of triumph. Keanu stayed until the last veteran left, shaking hands, sharing stories, ensuring every soul felt seen. When the yard finally emptied, he stood alone by the fire pit, the flames dying down to a soft glow, the air still and quiet. He looked at the house, at the paint-streaked walls he'd clean tomorrow, and felt not anger but peace, a hard-won peace forged in the crucible of this night. Keanu Reeves walked back inside, the door closing softly behind him, the world outside none the wiser to the battle he'd fought and won. The headlines would come later, wild, exaggerated tales of a barbecue-turned-war zone, but they'd miss the truth. This wasn't about a meltdown or a takedown. It was about honor, about resilience, about a man who'd stood for something greater than himself. The fire flickered out, the smoke curling into the dawn, and Keanu, ever the quiet hero, let the night fade into legend. If you enjoyed this story, there's another video on screen right now. Go ahead and give it a look for an even more astonishing tale. And don't forget, we'll have many more uplifting and dramatic stories coming your way. So make sure you subscribe to our channel, that way you'll never miss our newest uploads.